paper was folded so many times the creases looked tired. His handwriting slanted across the top, my son's name. Nursing home stamp, the date. Steam rose from the cup beside it, curling like a small excuse I couldn't accept. I held the letter and felt the room shrink. A familiar life reduced to a stamp and a signature. Some stories don't just tell pain, they reveal the truth. This is one of them. Voice of Aunt. He stood in the doorway with his coat half on, like he'd been interrupted. He moved quick, polite.
The way people move when they've practiced being kind and aren't sure why. "Mum, it's just for a few weeks," he said, the words wrapped in that familiar carefulness. "You'll like it there. They'll look after you." I looked at the tea. Steam faded into the air. I let the cup sit where he'd left it. Fingers still warm on the handle. The suitcase by the chair was closed, as if my life had been zipped up and taken somewhere for safekeeping. His wife, soft smile, bright bag, touched my arm. No one asked what I wanted. I did one small thing then. I folded the letter again, slower this time, and slid it into the inside pocket of my cardigan. A small decision, a private proof I could feel against my chest. I remember thinking, keep this. Keep it until you know what it is. He touched my hand like he was helping me. The touch felt like a door closing in a hallway I once walked through. "You'll be safer there," he said. "They do activities, meals, people around." The words had an inventory list tone. I smiled to show I understood. I didn't say the truth out loud, that safety was not the question. Trust was. That had been on loan for years, and someone had cashed it without telling me. Outside the window, a neighbour's lawnmower droned, ordinary and steady. Inside, the house was full of small relics, photo frames, a chipped vase, the stack of unpaid bills I had kept hidden in an old cookbook. I reached for the cookbook, thumbed the top bill, and left it where it was. Another small choice. Don't make a scene. Not yet. He helped me into the car. He hummed under his breath, a tune I knew from grocery runs and Sunday mornings. People hum when they want a quiet sound that says they are not cruel. He used that sound well. At the nursing home lobby, the receptionist smiled like a person trained to show the proper face. Papers were proffered, signatures requested. I signed the lines, my name like a stamp being placed on quiet transactions. Late that first afternoon, the room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something sweet from the kitchen. Baked goods, maybe. A television murmured down the hall. The sound came in and went out like weather. I sat on the bed and took the letter from my pocket. The folds had softened. I smoothed it on my knee and read the words again, the way someone reads a name carved on a bench. Slow, looking for memory in the letters. There was a small note scrawled in his hand at the bottom. "I'm doing what's best." That line had the weight people give to themselves when they've chosen convenience over courage. I pressed my thumb on the ink until a small smudge marked the paper. The smudge felt like a fingerprint of the moment, an imprint I could keep. A nurse came by with her cart and smiled like a message you can't decode. She put a blanket over my knees and said, "If you need anything, just press." She didn't stay. I pressed my palm to the blanket for a long minute, feeling the latex of the bedspread, the slight spring of the mattress, the subtle tilt of the pillow. It was a different kind of familiar, not mine, but arranged for me. I found the room quiet in a way that made my ears work harder. Voices from the corridor sounded like a radio playing someone else's life. I opened the small bedside drawer and found a pencil, a used tissue, a pamphlet about activities. I took the pencil and a piece of paper and wrote 3 words in a slow, firm hand. "I am here." Then I folded the paper and placed it under my pillow. Another small rebellion. Leave a note where I could wake to it. A private signal. That night, I didn't sleep much. I listened instead to the building settle. Air vent sighs, a distant cart rolling, the muffled conversation 2 doors down. In the dark, the cup from the afternoon glinted on the nightstand like a small monument to the ordinary. I touched the rim. It was cold. Memory moves in fragments. I remembered handing him his lunchbox when he was small, tucking a note inside the lid. Remembered the way his face crumpled the day his father died. How he'd taken my money to fix a car and promised me repayment like a vow. I remembered him as a boy who needed me, and as a man who had learned how to make decisions that kept his world tidy. That tidy had found me folded into a pocket. I thought of calling someone, an old friend, my sister in another town, but my fingers rested on the phone and then let it lie. I chose the silence once more. Another small move, not to be dramatic, not tonight. I wanted to wake with the paper against my palm and know I had kept a secret and a choice. Before sleep came, I traced the crease of the letter with a fingertip until the paper softened between my skin. The steam mark from the tea still hovered in my memory, curled and thin. I hummed a line under my breath, the same tune he'd hummed in the doorway. It felt like rehearsing a future I hadn't agreed to. The first act of living in a place you have not chosen is noticing the little proofs. A folded letter in your pocket, a cold cup on the nightstand, a signature on a line. I held these small things like stones and turned them over in my hand until they made sense. I decided then to be small and watchful, not helpless, not yet. The fluorescent light hummed like a thought that wouldn't stop. It sat above the bed with a steady, thin sound. Small, bright, relentless. At first I thought it was the building breathing. Then I knew it was the sound of places that keep time for you. The corridors were wide and smelled faintly of lemon and warmed bread. People moved through them with the careful pace of those who think their days are measured in routines. In the dining room, voices pooled around trays. Laughter came in little bright bursts, then faded. I watched a woman across from me dip a biscuit into her tea and close her eyes like there was a private pleasure there. I listened to the hum and let it fill the spaces where my own house used to be. The nurse who had tucked the blanket around my knees introduced herself as Claire, and I liked her name. Soft, reliable. She brought a small plate of soup and set it down with that efficient smile. "Do you want someone to sit with you while you eat?" she asked, as if offering company were part of her toolbox. I remembered how my mother had asked the same question years ago, and how I'd sat with her and held a hand until the spoon slipped. "No," I said quietly, and watched the spoon catch the light. "I'll manage." It sounded thinner than I meant. She nodded and talked about the activities board. Bingo on Thursday, a sing-along Monday, and I nodded too, keeping one ear on the list and the other on me. I started to look. Small things first. The nameplate outside my door, the pattern of footsteps on the linoleum, the way residents left notes on the corkboard, requests for newspapers, requests to be called if someone came. I found the corkboard oddly intimate. People left the smallest proofs of themselves there. Someone had pinned a child's drawing, bright and clumsy, the colours still loud. I smiled to see it. I felt both like a stranger and someone looking for an old address. A man down the hall caught my attention. He sat by a window with his hands folded on a walker, a photograph in a frame beside him. Not a table photo, one of those wallet-sized prints stood in plastic, like a memory kept in a pocket. He looked at the frame the way some people look at the sea, long and steady. I noticed him notice me, and he tilted his head as if recognizing an old voice. "You've got visitors?" I asked when I was close enough for the sound of my voice not to intrude. He looked up and smiled with an apology. "Not anymore. Just memories," he said. His voice had the soft grain of someone who had used it for a long time. There was no bitterness. only an acceptance that had the weight of a story. We didn't say much at first. We shared the kind of silence that is not empty. He told me his name, Mr. Harris, and the small detail that he liked to feed the birds in the courtyard because they remembered him in ways humans sometimes did not. I found myself telling him about the folded letter in my pocket without saying why it mattered. It felt natural to offer a small fact, like a breadcrumb. He glanced at my hands when I mentioned the letter, then at the frame beside him. "My daughter used to write me notes," he said. "Left them in my coat. Same handwriting for years, like all the seasons signed the same way." He smiled into a memory and then turned to the window. I watched his face soften, as if remembering the tune of someone's laugh. Curiosity is a quiet thing in old places. It doesn't roar. It peaks. I started to notice patterns. Who received visitors, who kept their doors closed, who had photographs tucked like talismans. I asked Claire for the activities board again, under the pretense of wanting to join in. She wrote my name down for knitting on Tuesday and a short stroll on Wednesday. A small move. I felt the day fill with something I could shape. Walking the corridor became a small ritual. I timed my steps to the hum of the lights, to the cart's distant wheels. I found a common room with a shelf of magazines and an old chess set. A boy from the kitchen, volunteer, I guessed, sat with an elderly woman and read a newspaper to her. The sound of his quiet voice struck me with a simple tenderness I didn't expect to miss. There was a moment that surprised me with its clarity. I was near the nurse's station when I saw my son's name in the visitor log. No signature, just his printed name, and a date crossed out. It was small and ordinary, and somehow enough. I felt a quick, sharp turn of the stomach that felt like being caught in someone else's storm. I folded the corner of the page with my finger and let it go. Another choice. See, then keep silent. Mr. Harris would come sit by the window each morning and feed the birds. He told stories, small pieces at first, about a bakery he once worked in, about a young man who used to run errands, about a woman who had a laugh like the chime of a small bell. There were names around those stories that fit into spaces in my own memory. One afternoon, his words dropped like stones into a calm pond and made a ring I could not ignore. "We used to help one another," he said quietly. "Sometimes people help in ways that don't get noticed at home." I kept watching him, reading the soft way his hands moved when he spoke. I started leaving little things on the bench outside, an extra biscuit, a napkin folded neat. He noticed. He looked at me like someone who has been given an unexpected companion. His eyes held a question and some relief, all in the same look. That evening, I held the small paper beneath my pillow and felt its edge like a secret blade. The fluorescent light hummed, and for the first time since I'd arrived, the hum sounded less like a machine and more like a metronome to a new pattern. I was learning the measure of this place. As the corridor lights softened for the night, Mr. Harris tapped the frame on his lap and said something that lingered in the air. "Some ties are kept in pockets until someone remembers to look." I folded that line into my quiet and let it keep me awake. The morning smelled faintly of rain and toast. The courtyard grass glistened like someone had been kind to it overnight. I stepped outside with my cardigan pulled close and the folded letter in my pocket. A habit now, almost like a heartbeat I could touch. Mr. Harris sat on the bench, scattering crumbs for the birds that seemed to recognize him. They came in quick darts of grey and white, their wings flashing between us like notes in a song. He glanced up and smiled. That quiet, patient smile that older men wear when they've learned the price of waiting. "You're early," he said. "I woke to a smell I didn't recognize," I told him. "Bread, maybe. It reminded me of home." He nodded, the corners of his mouth turning up. "That's from the kitchen. They bake in the mornings. I worked in a bakery once, years back." You learn that the smell of bread is the smell of forgiveness. The words caught me off guard, the kind of line you don't expect from someone you barely know. Forgiveness. I hadn't thought of it in months. He had a paper folded beside him, yellowed, frayed at the edges. Old crossword, he said. My daughter used to send them. I kept one. Habit, maybe. We talked like that. Not loudly, not constantly, just enough for time to stretch without breaking. When he laughed, it wasn't full. It was careful, like laughter that's been stitched back together. And somehow his voice felt familiar, not in sound, but in rhythm. The way he paused before certain words, that hesitation, it pulled something from deep inside my memory. I found myself saying, "You sound like someone I used to know." He smiled at that. Maybe I am. Maybe time just changed our names. I didn't answer, but the thought sat between us like an old photograph you can't quite place. That night, I wrote in my notebook. Not a diary, just loose thoughts. There's something about him that doesn't feel new. Maybe memories circle back when they can't find peace. Over the next week, our conversations became small rituals. We met at the same bench. Sometimes he'd bring an apple, slice it with a pocket knife, hand me half. Sometimes he'd talk about the sea. He'd lived near it once. He said it was the only sound louder than regret. Once, when the sun dipped and shadows stretched across the garden, he asked quietly, "What did your son do before you came here?" I hesitated. The question wasn't cruel, but it landed like a stone in still water. "He runs a company," I said. "Busy man. Always has been." He nodded. "Mine too. Always busy. Sometimes I wonder if the world rewards forgetfulness." There was a shared ache in that moment. Two old people sitting in a garden, each missing someone who still existed. He told me about his daughter, the one from the photograph. Her name was Lydia. "She used to bring home flowers she couldn't afford," he said, smiling at the memory. Said they were rescues. He looked down at his hands. "She stopped coming after my stroke. Letters came, but fewer each year. Maybe guilt fades faster than we think." I watched his hands tremble slightly as he brushed away crumbs. Old hands, still trying to be useful. And suddenly I wanted to tell him everything. The letter, the move, the silence from my son. But I didn't. Not yet. There's a dignity in holding your pain until it finds its right witness. One evening, the air smelled of rain again. The staff had turned on the soft garden lights, those small, warm bulbs that pretend to be stars. Mr. Harris sat there waiting, a new paper folded neatly beside him. "This came from the office today," he said. "Old files they keep losing and finding again. Turns out they still had my volunteer form from years ago. I used to visit this place after work. Long before I lived here." I blinked. "This same home?" He nodded. "Different name then. But same garden, same windows." He laughed softly. "Funny thing is, I used to drop off supplies here for a woman who lived nearby. Her husband had passed. Her son used to help me carry boxes. Small world." Something in my chest shifted. What was her name? He looked thoughtful. "I can't recall now. Margaret, maybe? Or Mary? No. There was a boy, Michael, always asking questions. Nice kid." My breath caught. "My husband's name was Daniel," I whispered. "And my son." He turned sharply, eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in memory. "I knew a Daniel," he murmured. "Tall, kind, worked with the council. He once lent me his car when my daughter was ill." My pulse slowed. You knew my husband?" He looked at me, long and hard, then exhaled. "If your name is Evelyn Hart, then yes, I did." The garden fell into a kind of hush. broken only by the soft hum of the lights and the faint chirp of a bird too stubborn to sleep. I didn't speak. I couldn't. He looked smaller somehow. Or maybe I did. After a while, he said, "Your husband was a good man. We talked about you once. He said you wrote letters he never had the courage to answer. After he passed, I wrote too. I never got a reply." I felt my throat tighten. I never received them. He nodded slowly, understanding more than I had said. "Someone kept them," he murmured. "That much is clear." That night, I couldn't sleep. The letter in my pocket suddenly felt heavier, like it carried more than my son's words. I thought of all the mail that had gone missing over the years, all the envelopes I'd never seen. And I remembered my son once saying, "You don't need to read everything, Mum. Some things only hurt." I lay awake until dawn, the sound of the hallway clock marking the slow truth of time. In the first pale light, I took the folded paper from my cardigan and smoothed it again. The ink shimmered faintly, as if the past itself was trying to get my attention. Somewhere between the smell of morning bread and the echo of his voice, I knew one thing. This wasn't just a nursing home. It was a place where forgotten stories waited to be found again. The morning came quiet, almost too gentle for what it carried. Rain had passed in the night, leaving the courtyard glistening. When I stepped out, the bench was wet, but waiting, like it remembered us. Mr. Harris was already there, his coat a shade darker from the damp. He smiled when he saw me. "You came," he said simply. "I was already awake," I told him. "Dreams don't last long here." He nodded, and we sat in silence until the sky began to lighten. The smell of wet leaves filled the air, and in that smell, something moved. An old pull of memory that had been quiet for too long. I reached into my bag, not sure why, and pulled out the small purse I'd kept tucked away since the day my son dropped me off. Inside were a few folded photographs, a receipt from years ago, and a scrap of ribbon that had once belonged to my husband's suit. The last photo had always felt heavier than paper. Daniel standing beside a man outside the old bakery, both smiling, both younger, the sunlight catching their faces in the same way. When I looked closer, I saw it. The man next to Daniel was Mr. Harris. My breath left me in one uneven sound. I turned the photo around and held it out to him. "You?" I said softly, almost unsure. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and memory. "Well, I'll be—" His voice cracked a little. "That's your husband. That's me." I nodded slowly, feeling the world tilt in the smallest way. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was just the sound of distant wheels on the linoleum and a nurse's laugh drifting from the building. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the corner of the photo. "He was a good friend," he said. "He helped me when I lost my job. Wouldn't take anything in return. I used to send letters to thank him. After he passed, I wrote to you. I thought maybe it would help us both." I looked at him then, really looked, and there it was, the same warmth that Daniel had always trusted in people. I felt something in me soften and ache all at once. "I never got them," I said quietly. "Not one." He frowned. "That doesn't make sense. I sent them. All of them. And one, years later, to your son. Told him I wanted to check in, to see how you were. He replied once, said you were doing fine and didn't want contact. That you'd moved on." The words felt like small stones dropped into my stomach. I saw my son's face in my mind. Kind, familiar, reassuring. And behind that kindness, something sharper I'd never wanted to name. "Maybe he thought he was protecting me," I whispered, but it came out sounding like I was trying to convince myself. Mr. Harris looked at me, calm but firm. Or himself. The photograph rustled in my shaking hands. I could almost feel Daniel in that silence, watching both of us. That afternoon, I asked Claire if she could help me check the mail records. Something small, harmless, I said. She hesitated, but finally agreed to let me look at the visitor logbook again. I turned the pages slowly until I found a small note in the corner of one. Letter held at front desk for E. Hart, per son's request. It was dated nearly a year ago. The air felt suddenly heavier, the edges of everything sharper. Claire looked over my shoulder, her brows furrowed. That's odd. We usually don't hold mail unless family insists. He must have... I didn't let her finish. I thanked her and walked back to my room, the words burning behind my ribs. When I sat on the bed, I unfolded the photograph again. The faces looked peaceful, honest. I traced Daniel's smile with my finger. It was the kind of smile that never imagined betrayal in the blood it raised. I spent that evening by the window, the photo in my lap, the folded letter beside it. The hum of the building was quieter than usual, like even the walls were listening. I thought about the years since Daniel's death, how the money had dwindled faster than I understood, how the house repairs never seemed to get done, how my son had handled every paper for me because he didn't want me to stress, how I'd trusted him without reading a single line. I thought about all the envelopes I'd never opened, all the kindnesses I'd never received. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I let the truth breathe. He hadn't sent me here because I was a burden. He'd sent me here because I might have remembered what he wanted forgotten. That realization didn't make me angry, not the loud kind of anger. It was quieter, a still lake that knew how deep it went. I folded the photograph again and placed it inside the old cookbook I'd brought from home, the same one I used to hide unpaid bills in. That night, I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep either. But I did something small again. I wrote a note, short, simple, and slipped it inside my cardigan pocket beside the letter. Truth doesn't vanish. It just waits for someone to remember. The next morning, I went back to the bench. Mr. Harris was there already, his eyes kind and waiting. He saw the photograph still in my hand and gave a soft, knowing nod. "No need to rush it," he said gently. "Truth finds its way when the heart stops shaking." I smiled faintly. "Mine's still trembling," I said. He looked up at the grey sky, where the light had started to spread like a slow forgiveness. "That means it's still alive." For the first time since I arrived, I believed him. "Would you forgive them if this happened to you?" That day, as I walked back to my room, I felt lighter but colder inside. The kind of cold that isn't from weather. It's from knowing something you can't unknow, something you'll have to decide what to do with next. The knock came just before lunch, 2 soft taps, then the sound of a polite throat clearing. I knew it was him before the door even opened. Some bonds, no matter how bruised, still hum through the air like a low, unshakable tune. He stood there, my son, jacket crisp, smile trained, his wife beside him holding a paper bag that looked too clean to be real. "Mum," he said with that practiced warmth, "look at you. You look well. They're taking good care of you." I noticed how his eyes didn't meet mine right away. Guilt always has a scent. It's the silence between sentences. The air between us was fragile, like glass that had already cracked but not yet fallen apart. I smiled, because mothers do. "You came?" I said, keeping my voice steady. It must have been a busy week. He laughed softly, adjusting his cuff. "Always is. But we wanted to see you. Brought some of those muffins you like?" His wife stepped forward, placing the bag on my bedside table like an offering. "Blueberry," she said. "They're fresh." I thanked her. I didn't open it. For a few minutes, conversation danced around the safe topics. The weather, his office, the nurse who seemed lovely. I watched the way he spoke, all tidy, all measured. I realized he thought he could talk the air back to normal. When he finally paused, I asked, "Do you ever hear from the man who worked with your father at the council?" His hand froze halfway to the cup of water. Just half a second, barely visible, but a mother sees half seconds for what they are. "What man?" he said, pretending not to know. "Mr. Harris," I replied gently. "You remember him, don't you?" He blinked, once, twice, then reached for the cup and took a sip too slow to be casual. "I think I do. It's been a long time." His wife looked between us, puzzled. "Who's Mr. Harris?" she asked. Before I could answer, a voice came from the hallway, calm, familiar. "Excuse me, Evelyn, did you leave this photo on the bench?" He stepped in, Mr. Harris, holding the very picture I'd shown him the day before. The light caught his silver hair just right, softening the room. He smiled kindly at me, then turned his eyes toward my son. Recognition hit them both at once, silent and heavy. My son's jaw tensed. Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in memory. "I know you," he said softly. "You used to visit your father's office, always polite, always asking questions." My son forced a laugh. "That must have been years ago." "Not so many," Mr. Harris said, his tone still calm. "I wrote you once, after your father passed. You told me your mother didn't want contact." He looked toward me. "I'm glad you finally got my letter." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through time. My son opened his mouth, then closed it again. His wife turned toward him slowly. "You said you told me she never got any letters." He exhaled hard through his nose, the way he did when cornered as a child. "Let's not do this here," he muttered. I spoke then, softly, almost kindly. "No, let's. Here is good. Here is honest." He looked at me, something desperate flickering behind his eyes. "Mom, you don't understand. I was trying to protect you. You were fragile after Dad died. You didn't need reminders." "Reminders?" I said quietly. "You mean friends? You mean truth?" He flinched. I stood up, slower than my heart wanted me to, and took the photo from Mr. Harris's hand. I placed it gently on the table between us, between mother and son, between lie and air, Daniel and Mr. Harris, smiling in the sun. My son stared at it as if the picture itself was speaking. "I didn't mean harm," he whispered. "Harm doesn't always mean hate," I said. "Sometimes it just means you stopped listening when I still had a voice." He looked down, his hands twisting the edge of his sleeve. "I thought you'd move on. I thought—" "You thought convenience was care," I said. The words left me calm, not cruel. They felt like a truth finally settling into its shape. His wife reached for his arm, whispering something I didn't catch. He didn't answer her. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. After a long silence, he said, "You're angry." I shook my head. "No, I'm awake." He swallowed hard. The clock in the hallway ticked loud enough for everyone to hear. Time had stopped pretending. When they left, he kissed my forehead, out of habit, not affection, and said, "I'll call you soon." I smiled the way people smile when they finally understand they won't be fooled again. "I'll be here," I said, "just not waiting." When the door closed, I sat back down. The muffins were still unopened. Mr. Harris lingered near the doorway, unsure whether to stay. "You don't owe him revenge," he said gently. "I know," I replied. "But I owed myself truth. That's all." He nodded. "That's rarer than forgiveness." We sat there a while, no words, no pretending. The photo on the table looked softer in the fading light, like the past itself had exhaled. That night, I didn't cry. I just opened the window and let the cool air in. Outside, The garden lights flickered like small, brave stars. Somewhere in the hallway, the clock kept ticking, not loud, not fast, just steady. And I thought, quietly, justice doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it just stands in a room, breathing. The morning after they left, the air felt weightless, the kind that comes after a storm when the sky looks freshly washed, but nothing underneath it has changed yet. The photo still sat on the table, a quiet witness. I didn't move it. I wanted it to see what came next. The hallways were unusually still that day. The nurses spoke softly, as if the building knew I needed silence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed gentler. Mr. Harris met me by the window near the garden. He didn't speak at first, and I was grateful. Words can bruise after a day like that. We sat together, watching the sparrows dive into the wet grass. He passed me my tea and said, "You slept?" "A little," I said. But it wasn't rest. It was just time passing quietly. He nodded, the way people nod when they've outgrown advice. After breakfast, I went to the nurse's desk and asked for one of those thin envelopes they use for donations. Claire raised her eyebrows but didn't question it. She just handed me one and said, "It's a good day for decisions." I smiled faintly. She didn't know how right she was. Back in my room, I opened the small drawer under the bed. Inside were the few papers I had left. My savings account statement, my will, the little list of charities I'd once thought I'd never use. I read each one carefully this time. No signatures skipped, no blanks ignored. It took me most of the morning to write the letters. Simple ones. One to my lawyer, one to the school that Mr. Harris's granddaughter attended, the one he'd mentioned when he talked about Lydia's children. The rest of what I owned, small, but still mine, would go there. Books, jewelry, the house sale balance, everything. I didn't write my son's name anywhere, not out of anger, just precision. When I sealed the envelopes, I felt my hands steady for the first time in weeks. Sometimes peace doesn't come from forgiveness, it comes from clarity. At lunch, my son called. The nurse brought the phone in, smiling politely, unaware of what her hands carried. I picked it up and heard his voice, cautious, tender, rehearsed. "Mum, I wanted to make sure you're okay." I looked out the window. The sunlight caught the dust on the glass, making it glow. "I'm fine," I said. "Just finishing some paperwork." He hesitated. "You sound different." "Awake," I said quietly. "I sound awake." He went silent for a moment. "I didn't mean for things to go wrong." "They didn't," I told him. "They went exactly where truth needed them to." He breathed in, the kind of breath that tries to build a wall again. "I'll visit tomorrow. We can talk properly." "You don't need to," I said gently. "Some things make more sense from a distance." He didn't argue, just said my name softly. "Mom?" before the line clicked dead. The silence after that felt cleaner than his words ever had. That evening, I sat with Mr. Harris in the garden. He had a small radio, the kind that crackles between songs. He tuned it until a soft jazz station came through. Trumpet, piano, a voice that sounded like warmth. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. There's a kind of companionship that doesn't demand stories anymore, just presence. He looked over after a while. "Do you regret it?" I shook my head. "No. I regret waiting so long to remember myself." He smiled faintly. "Then you're luckier than most." The sun was setting, its light brushing the tops of the trees in gold. I watched it spread across my hands. These old, veined hands that had held too much and still learned how to open again. I thought of Daniel, of the life we built in quiet corners, of the trust that had survived everything except comfort. And then I thought of my son, not as a villain, Not as a stranger, just as a man who had mistaken fear for love. The world teaches that in different ways. I think, I said softly, peace is when you stop trying to fix the ones who broke you and start tending what's left standing. Mr. Harris nodded. And what's left standing? Me, I said. He smiled, a little sad, a little proud. Then that's enough. The next week, the lawyer called. The papers were processed, the transfer done. Claire congratulated me, thinking it was about donations. I just thanked her and asked if she could place a copy of the documents in the drawer with my photo. She did. And for the first time, that drawer didn't feel like storage. It felt like closure. Days passed quietly. My son didn't come again, though he called once. I didn't pick up. Some silences are not punishments. They're fences. Gentle ones. Mr. Harris and I began a new habit. Morning tea at the same window where I'd once felt trapped. Now it felt like belonging. The air changed with the season. Leaves began to yellow, the sky stretched wider. I realized I'd stopped counting the days since I arrived. One morning I woke early. The first sunlight touched my face. The world was quiet except for the faint hum of the hallway heater. I sat up slowly, poured the leftover tea into a fresh cup, and looked outside. The birds were back, small, fluttering, hungry. I thought of all the people who had fed them before me, all the stories that had ended and started on that same patch of grass. I whispered, almost to myself. I didn't win anything. I just stopped losing myself. And it was true. The letter still sat in my cardigan pocket, worn, soft, but now harmless. The proof that once stung had turned into a reminder of what I'd survived. I didn't throw it away. I didn't frame it. I just let it rest where it belonged, beside my heart, but no longer in it. Mr. Harris joined me soon after, his steps slow but steady. He handed me a biscuit, still warm from breakfast. Peace looks good on you, he said quietly. I smiled. It finally fits. We sat there, letting the light do what light does best, heal without asking permission. I stayed silent, but the truth found its voice. Stories like this never fade. Voice of Aunt.